In the dusty town of Redemption Gulch, where the sun beat down like a blacksmith's hammer, an unusual auction was underway. It wasn't horses or cattle being sold, but folk, debtors forced into servitude to clear their last debts. The air hung thick with the scent of sweat, dust, and cheap tobacco, a true frontier mix. On a rickety wooden platform stood a man, his left leg dragging as if it had known too many hard miles. Beside him, two young boys, twins, their faces streaked with grime, eyes wide and unblinking. They didn't cry, didn't speak. The auctioneer's voice boomed, "One man, former drover, two lads, opening bid, $10. A heavy silence followed. No one spoke, no one bid. The man, Elias Vance, stood as tall as his broken leg would allow, his eyes holding a weariness that spoke of a lifetime of hardship. He was tired of being property, tired of being unable to shield the boys from this cruel world. At the edge of the sparse crowd, a woman appeared. Her worn calico dress stretched over a swelling belly, and her eyes, deep and dark, held a wisdom beyond her years. This was Martha Reed, a widow, 6 months gone, with not a penny to her name nor kin to lean on. She carried only a small satchel and a resolve as sturdy as an old oak. Martha hadn't come to save anyone, she came for herself. Where others saw only a doomed man and two burdens, Martha saw strong hands, even with a limp. She needed someone who could chop wood, tend a mule, coax life from the soil, and keep a roof over her head when her time came. And the boys? Their silence was a familiar echo of her own recent grief. $15, a gruff voice called from the back, followed by a sneer. Anyone for more? 17, a clear, steady voice cut through the air. The crowd parted as Martha stepped forward. The auctioneer scoffed. Martha pulled a small leather pouch from her coat, counting out a handful of weathered coins. I've got $27, all of it, for all three. The silence stretched, thick as molasses. Sold, the auctioneer finally bellowed, his voice laced with annoyance. Martha handed over the coins. Elias looked at her, his eyes holding no gratitude, no anger, just a silent question. Why? Martha didn't answer. She simply turned and walked towards her waiting mule cart. Follow, if you want to live, she called over her shoulder. And so Elias and the two boys, with nothing left to lose, followed the woman who had nothing left to keep. The journey to Martha's small cabin, nestled at the valley's edge where the land was fertile and a stream whispered nearby, was silent. Martha was accustomed to quiet. She'd known a kind husband, lost him to a brutal winter storm, then another phantom figure who had left her with a child and no farewell. She understood loss, helplessness, and the way silence could hold a broken heart together. Inside the cabin, she handed Elias a worn blanket. You can stay until the snow flies, she said. If you work hard, eat less than you talk, and don't mind a pregnant woman underfoot. Elias surveyed the humble dwelling, then looked at Martha. I'm not used to accepting charity. No charity here, she replied. Just a trade. I need help, and you need shelter. So they lived, 3 bought, 1 out of quiet desperation. Day after day, Martha rose with the sun, cooking, sweeping, planting her meager garden. Elias chopped wood, patched the leaky roof, and took the boys, James and Thomas, out for air. Words were scarce, but the silence between them grew comfortable, like the steady sigh of the wind through the pines. One night, Martha woke to the soft sound of a movement. She found James, one of the twins, by the window. Can't you sleep? She asked, surprised to hear any sound from him. James didn't look at her. We're killing you, ma'am, he whispered. Martha was stunned. Pa didn't say nothing, James continued, his voice barely audible. We ain't spoken since Ma. We was afraid if we said the wrong thing, you'd leave us too. Martha knelt, pulling the trembling boy into her arms. It's not your fault, she whispered, and Elias won't leave. Ever? In the darkness, she heard Elias's steady breathing from the next room. She wasn't sure if he'd heard, but the next morning, Martha found Elias building an extra cot for the boys. Deeds, not words, sometimes spoke loudest. You might think Martha saved Elias, but in truth, they saved each other. And this was just the beginning. The small cabin in the valley, once so quiet, began to fill with more than just footsteps. The gentle crackle of the morning fire, the rhythmic thud of Elias's axe in the afternoon, even unnoticed sighs in moments of quiet contemplation. Martha had brought Elias and the boys home, but that didn't mean they belonged. Elias mended the fences, checked the roof, and sometimes vanished at dawn to gather firewood. He spoke little, nodding or shaking his head when Martha asked for help, his eyes often far away, searching for something lost. James and Thomas remained strangely subdued. They ate their meals, obeyed Martha, but neither laughed, played, nor cried. Martha didn't ask why, at least not with words. She saw them glance at each other when their mother was mentioned, saw James clutching a frayed handkerchief tucked in his sleeve. She understood, better than anyone, the fear of uttering a word that could shatter everything. Martha had her own ghosts. The child she carried wasn't from her deceased husband, William. The man she'd loved, who'd perished in the winter, wasn't the father. She didn't need judgment, but it didn't lessen the loneliness. Sometimes at night, she'd sit on the porch steps, arms wrapped around her swelling belly, feeling the tiny kicks. Would this child, born without a father's love, receive enough from her for both of them? Elias noticed. He'd caught her weeping once, her tears mingling with the stream as she washed vegetables. She never knew he'd seen, but from that day he began to do more. Still, a quiet distance remained between them, like a room no one dared to enter. One morning, Martha found Elias's old saddlebag by the door. Inside were a few clothes, a pocket knife, and a worn leather belt. No goodbye, no explanation. He was leaving. Martha didn't try to stop him. As he passed, she spoke a single sentence. "I didn't buy you out of pity." Elias paused, then continued into the yard, walking towards the stream where the boys often played. Martha watched, her heart tightening. Not because she'd lost a helper, but because she felt a great, unnamed hope slipping away. Then a scream, a low, panicked, broken sound. Martha ran. Elias had cast aside his walking stick and plunged into the stream he'd avoided for days due to his unsteady leg. The water was shallow, but the current was swift. James had slipped, caught in the middle, thrashing in terror. Elias pulled him to shore, then nearly collapsed from exhaustion. Martha arrived to find Elias on the ground, one arm wrapped around a wet, shaking James. Thomas knelt beside him, his face pale. "I'm sorry," James stammered, his voice breaking like a dam. "I didn't mean to go so far. I just wanted to see the fish." Elias said nothing, just pulled the boy close, holding him tight. For the first time since their arrival, his arms weren't stiff, weren't reserved. They were a father's arms. "I was afraid I'd say the wrong thing and you'd leave," James mumbled, "like Ma. You left us too." "No one left you, son," Elias said softly, his voice rough with cold and weariness. "Not because of me." James burst into tears, and so did Thomas. Martha knelt beside them, laying a hand on Elias's shoulder. For the first time, they weren't entirely separate. It was a start. That night, the oil lamp in the cabin burned longer than usual. Martha made ginger tea, handing a cup to Elias without a word, without expecting anything in return. Elias took it quietly, but the way he looked at her was different now. No longer the eyes of a man poised to retreat, but the eyes of a man who had chosen to stay. Martha sat beside him, her hands clutching her heavy belly. "I don't expect you to replace anyone," she said. "I just want to live, and I think if anyone understands that, it's you." Elias nodded. "I don't know how to be a father," he said softly. "I just don't want to see them drown, literally or figuratively." "That's enough," Martha replied. They said nothing more, but in that silence, something shifted. Elias never left again. The boys began to talk more. Martha laughed more. And for a brief moment that fall afternoon, as they ate dinner under the ramshackle roof, they were no longer just a bought man and two quiet boys. They were a family, though no one dared to call them that. The wind shifted one afternoon in late October. It wasn't the usual autumn gust. It was an invisible change in the air that made Elias stand mid-chop, his axe handle gripped tight, his gaze fixed on the trail leading into the valley. From the kitchen, Martha sensed it too. Her belly was so heavy she had to brace herself against the table, but she made her way to the door where the two boys were playing in the hay. A cloud of dust rose on the horizon, a column of riders. 4, then 6, then 8. At the head was a man Martha had prayed she'd never see again, Silas Blackwood. His face was as sharp and smug as ever, his eyes as cold as the last time she'd seen him disappear into the night, leaving her in the abandoned barn. Martha froze, her hand clenching over her stomach. Elias stepped forward, knowing without being told, without needing confirmation. The past had returned, and this time it brought firearms, forged papers, and a band of hired guns. "Well, well, Martha," Silas drawled, his voice like a snake slithering through tall grass. "Heard you're doing well for yourself. Looks like my baby's on the way, eh?" Martha didn't reply. Elias stood before her, tall as an old timber wall, his eyes burning with a fire he thought long extinguished. "Get off this land," Elias said, his voice not loud, but as stark as the first shot of a range war. Silas chuckled. "Oh, I'm afraid not. According to these papers, approved by the local magistrate, old William Reed left behind a gambling debt larger than anyone knew, and as the legal assignee, I have the right to foreclose on this claim," Martha gasped. "That's a lie." "William never gambled," Silas merely shrugged. "Evidence is everything, and I've got it. Ledgers, witnesses, even a notary. Whether folks believe it or not, that's their concern." Elias silently drew his old Colt from behind his back, not raising it, just letting his hand rest on the worn grip as a warning. Silas glanced down, then curled his lip. "You haven't changed, Elias. Still the same fool who thinks honor can save lives." Martha turned to Elias, surprised and fearful. "You know him?" Elias didn't look back. "He was my partner 3 years back, on a cattle drive to Abilene. Cut off my water, left me in a dust storm, and rode off with our earnings. I lived, but my leg didn't." Martha was stunned, their seemingly unrelated pasts now intersecting in the form of the man who threatened their only home. "I'm not here to spill blood," Silas said, gesturing to his men fanned out across the valley. "I'm here to reclaim what's mine. You can leave peacefully or otherwise." Elias didn't answer. No one moved. Only the sound of the wind through the half-repaired roof and the old brass bell by the cow shed, silent, as if waiting for a reason to ring. That night they didn't sleep. Martha sat by the window, the two boys huddled close on the bed, seeking warmth from the approaching storm. Elias sat on the porch, his rifle across his knees, eyes fixed on the gate. He calculated firing lines, enemy numbers, the slope of the land, the wind's direction, but deep down he knew he couldn't protect Martha and help deliver a child at the same time. And then, as if fate itself sought to twist the knife, Martha's contractions began. At first they were mere tremors. She held her breath, hoping they'd pass, but they came back stronger, more regular. By dawn, she could no longer stand. "Elias," she called, her voice a low gasp. He was there instantly. "It started," she whispered. "A week early." He nodded. "You stay still. You can't hold this house and play midwife." Martha squeezed his hand. "If you leave, I could die. If you stay, the boys could be shot." Elias looked around, then ran to the stable. He took the brass bell rope, the kind used to signal fires and raiders, climbed onto the roof, and pulled 3 decisive times. The bells echoed through the valley, 1, 2, 3. Then silence. He returned, his eyes no longer fearful. If no one came, he would stay. If someone heard, there was still hope. Outside, Silas's mercenaries stirred. Did they think it was a signal to retreat or to attack? No one knew, but no one dared to risk it. They held their ground, awaiting orders. Inside, Martha groaned. Elias put James and Thomas to work, tending the small stove, fetching clean towels, bringing sips of water. The boys had never worked so hard, not out of fear, but because for the first time they understood. This was home. And if home was lost, all was lost. Near noon, as Martha's pain reached its peak, the distant sound of hooves came. 1, 5, 10 wagons, riders, clubs, rifles, men from Redemption Gulch. Leading them was old Josiah Miller, the neighboring rancher, then Mrs. Albright, the general store owner, and finally Pastor Williams, holding his wooden cross high like a banner. Silas Blackwood yelled, "This is none of your business." Miller roared back, "Stealing land from a woman in childbirth? We won't stand by and watch." Elias stood, rifle ready, like a lion among wolves. "Whoever wants this land will go through my dead body first." Silas drew his gun, but no one fired. For from the little house behind Elias came the first cry of a newborn, a sound that cut through the silence louder than any threat, louder than any forged document. It was the sound of life, the sound of a family that had just grown by another member, and a fourth bell rang in the hearts of those who witnessed it. No one had the right to take this away. The bell had stopped ringing, but its echoes still resonated in the hearts of the townsfolk. It didn't just awaken the sleepy consciousness of every home in the valley, it stirred the most fundamental human values, honor and compassion. When the first riders appeared on the hillside, everyone thought they were federal agents, but recognizing the familiar faces, the butcher, the blacksmith, the apothecary, Elias understood. No one had ordered them. They had come by choice. They had come for Martha, for the unborn child, for the quiet kindness Elias and Martha had cultivated in that small cabin. In the midday sun, crude rifles clanged against old saddle leather, and wagon wheels rattled across the hard ground. More than 24 men, ill-armed but resolute. Josiah Miller stepped down from a cart loaded with farm tools and a rusty shotgun. His face was lined with age, but his voice rang like a church bell. "Brothers, this ain't about land. This is about right and wrong." Several of Silas's mercenaries looked at each other. One quietly asked, "Are we truly going to shoot at plain folk?" Silas Blackwood stood still for a few moments. He hadn't expected his game, built on flimsy papers and promises of silver, to be shattered by something so ancient, community. Inside the cabin, Martha let out a heart-wrenching groan. Sweat beaded on her temples, her hands gripped the bedsheets, her vision blurred by the searing pain. Mrs. Albright, now the unofficial midwife, thundered her orders. "More water! Clean towels! Elias, keep her awake!" James and Thomas, 2 boys who had barely spoken a word in weeks, now moved like 2 little soldiers. There was no panic in their eyes, only the certainty they'd learned from Elias. Survival was not for the hesitant. Martha cried out again, a final sound before silence, then a suffocating quiet, and then the cry, a thin, reedy sound, but it shook the very air. Hope's first cry. Outside, with guns still clenched, Elias looked up, his eyes wet with something he couldn't name. The child had come, choosing no other day, no other circumstance. It had chosen to be born in the heart of a standoff. And that made it the first true testament of love between 2 broken souls. Silas Blackwood stared at the cabin as if the cry had struck him in the gut, not a bullet, but the crushing weight of defeat. For the first time he signaled to his men to pull back. No one moved, no one believed he was right anymore. As the hoofbeats of the mercenaries faded over the hills, Silas didn't leave. He turned his horse and rode alone towards the cabin. He stopped about 20 paces from the porch and dismounted. His eyes were no longer mischievous, but broken, hidden behind a mask of pride. "Come out, Elias," he called. "No need for a crowd. Just the 2 of us." Elias stepped out, unarmed, only silence and a gaze that was no longer angry, but painfully understanding. Silas ripped the pistol from his belt and threw it to the ground. He drew another, keeping his hand hovering over the holster. "You once said I wasn't worth it. Prove it today." "That's done," Elias said. "Number not yet. The child in that house is my blood." Elias was silent for a few seconds, then answered in a low voice, but each word was like a nail hammered into oak. "It is our love." Silas blinked. He wanted to argue, to laugh, to reopen old wounds, but all were stifled by the undeniable truth. Elias spoke not as a man defending property, but as a father defending something more sacred than honor. "Shoot," Elias said, holding out his arms. "If that's what it takes to end this." But Silas couldn't. He could not shoot a man who had no hatred left, a man who had just seen a child brought into the world, a child he had thought was merely the result of a mistake. Silas turned away, defeated not by the loss of ground, but by the first realization of the emptiness of being alone. A few hours later, the local marshal's wagon arrived. Silas was arrested without resistance. He didn't argue, didn't claim innocence. For the first time, he understood he'd lost the only thing truly worth having: trust. Elias walked into the house. Martha held their baby Hope in bed. She looked up at him, needing no words. James and Thomas sat beside her, each holding a corner of the swaddling blanket, as if to assure the world that Hope would never be harmed. Pastor Williams approached from behind and placed a hand on Elias's shoulder. "You could have gone anywhere," he said, "but you chose to stay, and that is something this town won't forget." Elias nodded. He didn't say thank you. He just looked at the people in the small room: a widow, 2 quiet boys, a child born in a siege. They weren't blood. They weren't what anyone would call a proper family, but they were family. 6 months after little Hope's first cry echoed amid the gunfire, the barren stretch of land that once witnessed the auctioning of human lives had become home to a new family. No more prying eyes, no more forged documents, no more threats from grasping men. There was only the quiet hum of peace, the soft patter of small footsteps on the wooden floor each morning, the laughter of children in the yard, and the chime of the old bronze bell, quiet now, no longer needed to call for help, but still there as a reminder that when a community unites, nothing is impossible. Elias and Martha were married on a sunny April morning. No elaborate wedding, no silk gown, no grand feast. Just a small altar in front of the community church, a wreath of wild prairie flowers that James and Thomas had woven themselves, and a simple vow: "I'm not going anywhere." During the ceremony, Hope was held in Pastor Williams's arms, her gray eyes wide to the sunlight streaming through the church windows, as if she, too, knew she was the heart of an unexpected story. The adoption papers were signed by the same magistrate who had investigated Silas Blackwood's treachery. "The law usually lags behind the heart," he'd said, but today it caught up. James and Thomas stood beside Martha, each holding a corner of the certificate, as if to ensure no one would ever take them away again. Elias had been invited back into the world of commerce. Invitations arrived regularly from the Redemption Gulch Town Council and the Regional Development Board, offering him a position as an agricultural consultant, a lead on a new cattle expansion, even an offer from a political committee wanting him to run for mayor. He read them, then tucked them away in a drawer, not because he wasn't grateful, but because they came from a world he had left and no longer yearned for. One evening, as they sat on the porch, Hope asleep in Martha's arms, James and Thomas huddled together reading by the light of an oil lamp, Martha asked, "Do you ever regret not taking them?" Elias looked out at the horizon where the prairie shimmered in the moonlight at the home they had built from the ashes of a broken dream, and said, "No, Martha. I regret ever thinking I needed all those things to feel like someone. Now I know who I am, a husband, a father, and a man who knows when enough is enough." The answer was clear. The town of Redemption Gulch, once a dusty waypoint for fortune seekers, was now hailed as a hub of regional development. A railway extension was planned, bringing with it schools, clinics, even a library. A new world was about to emerge from what was once a lawless frontier. Martha received an offer to become a community coordinator, a prestigious position with a handsome salary and her own office in the town hall. She read the letter, smiled, and burned it in the wood stove. "We have it all right here," she said, as if responding to any other life-altering opportunity. Every morning, Elias taught his 2 sons how to mend fences, how to read the weather in the clouds, how to till the soil without harming the prairie grass. Every afternoon, Martha taught them to read, to share hope, to mend clothes, and to count the stars.